Welcome back to another episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today I have a very special treat as I have two guests on the podcast. I have Simon Hill and Layne Norton, and you're going to really get a lot out of this conversation because they are two of the most respected people in the space of nutrition, health, and nutrition science. And I'm not going to get into their bios here because I asked them to provide in-depth detail on how they got into the space of nutrition, health, and wellness on the show. And despite their differences in the way they personally choose to eat, I was shocked at the level of disagreement that these two had. So with that said, let's get this conversation going and welcome Layne Norton and Simon Hill to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Simon, Layne, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate you having us.
Doug, pleasure to be here. Thanks for organizing it.
Yeah, and I respect you both a lot for what you do and the work that you do. And what's fascinating to me about both of you is that you both are heavily involved in researching for nutrition science. You have an extensive background in this, but as far as like your personal dietary patterns, you know, how you choose to eat, it's quite different. So I think the best way to do this is for those who listen to my show who maybe aren't as familiar with each of you, if you could just give like a quick 1 to 2 minute intro on what your background is and like what your main mission behind what you do is.
Thanks, Layne. Yeah, so for me, I've been interested in science, Doug, for as long as I can remember. I would come home as a kid, and I'm sure Layne can sort of understand this or relate to this, I should say. And my dad would have these journal papers printed out. They were all over the damn house. I'd get into the car, he'd pick me up from school, and they'd be all over the seat, and I'd have to shift them to the side, and he'd have little bits and pieces highlighted. And as a kid, I had no idea what any of this actually meant, but I knew that science meant a lot to my dad. And my dad's a professor in physiology and has been doing that for 30 or 40 years, and it's very well published in the major journals. And I guess growing up in that environment really showed me what science is about and how we can use science to reduce uncertainty in the world and really respect it. I went on to do an undergraduate degree in physiotherapy. I was working in private practice in a sports physiotherapy clinic and with professional footballers in Australia. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the football over in Oz, but it's a little different with AFL players. And I really enjoyed that experience working with people one-on-one and helping them work through injuries and rehabilitation. I then went on to do a master's in nutrition science at Deakin University, which is quite a highly regarded nutrition program, I guess. You know, today I kind of split my time between consulting with people one-on-one. I do that just because I enjoy working with folks one-on-one. I don't see many people, but I still like to maintain that at some capacity. And then I spend most of my time with education online, podcast, social media, my book that I published with Penguin. And the idea there is to kind of take a lot of the deeper science. I've had many conversations with my dad where things that he is saying goes over my head and trying to slow him down and sort of just make sense of all different types of science and make it accessible to people online that maybe don't have the time to kind of go through things and are caught up in some of the confusion.
So I ended up in a very similar place as you, Simon, but had a very different road to get there. So I basically got into lifting weights when I was in my teenage years because I got picked on a lot, got no attention from girls. So I picked up weightlifting to try and fix those things, and it didn't fix either one of those things, but I just got really into weightlifting. Changed my major in college to biochemistry, and then just didn't know what I wanted to do with my life by the time I was finishing my major, so went and did a Ph.D. in Nutritional Sciences in Dr. Don Lehman's lab at University of Illinois. So very highly regarded institution for nutritional science research as well. And specifically, my research was in protein metabolism. So, got some really good education, which helped me out a lot. And now I kind of, consider myself, I do have a few clients like Simon. I cut my teeth coaching for a long time. I mean, probably well over 2,000 clients over like a 15-year period. But now I do more like scalable stuff with I have a nutrition coaching app, Carbon Diet Coach. I have online like training templates and programs called the Workout Builder. So like a supplement line, evidence-based supplement line that doesn't have crazy marketing. In fact, I just did a post yesterday about our whey protein, and I'm like, you don't need this. If you get enough protein in your diet, you don't need this. But if you find you have trouble getting protein in your diet, ours is a high quality whey protein that might be able to help. So hopefully you'll consider us. So, really sexy marketing. But I fundamentally consider myself a science communicator. So really, I try to take to heart, if you cannot explain something simply, then you don't understand it. And I think a lot of the problems that Simon and I, especially on Twitter, we see is people get so caught up in the mechanistic stuff, which I think is it's important to be able to discuss that stuff and understand the mechanisms. But so many people, they step over dollars to pick up pennies. And I think that that's a lot of the confusion that's out there is when you give people conflicting information, they don't really understand how to determine, okay, this conflicts with this, but oh, by the way, the magnitude on this is 100-fold more than this other thing that's conflicting. So it's not actually conflicting. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I appreciate you both for sharing that. And I think people are going to get a lot out of this episode. And really, the reason I wanted to do this is I've been a trainer for over 11 years now. And I can't tell you how problematic it can be to help walk my clients through diet and nutrition, because there's so much noise out there. And most of my clients, in many ways, are starting a diet based on a headline, not based on the fact that they actually want to start to better themselves. I get questions all the time like, hey, should I go vegan? Should I do this cleanse? Should I go keto? And I'm just just focus on drinking more water, eating more whole foods, getting better sleep, and moving your body more. Once you master that, then we can figure out the next step. So my first question that I want to unpack with both of your perspectives on this is, there's a lot of crap out there. But if you had to pick one thing, what's the biggest diet myth out there that you think is making people unhealthy?
I think I have a little bit of a different perspective on this. It would be easy for me to say carnivore, because people are just piling down saturated fat and whatnot. I think that's a pretty small subsection of people that are actually doing that. So when it comes to nutrition misinformation, I think it's just the volume of overall misinformation that is the biggest problem. Just the messaging from not just social media, but the mainstream media. If you even today, you walk into the supermarket and it's lose 60 pounds in 2 months, and it's find out, calories don't matter. It's about your hormones, all this various stuff. And quite honestly, I think that it's just not one particular thing in general. I think it's just the sheer volume that people are faced with, that they, either they end up just jumping from fad to fad, going down each rabbit hole, or you get the person that goes, I have no idea and screw it. I'm just not even going to worry about it. So I think that sheer volume of stuff is really the biggest impediment for people to kind of get healthy. And I think also the one other thing I'll say is I think there's a real culture battle right now with two extremes that are the loudest voices. And on one extreme, we have people that are 100% personal responsibility, everything, right? Which there's some good things about personal responsibility, but these are also the same folks that, well, if you're fat, you're just lazy and you're a glutton, And then we also have another side of that, which is nothing is anybody's responsibility and it's all just so societal and you don't have any control over anything. And, that kind of empathy can be really great in some ways, but it also basically says everyone's a victim. You don't have the ability to change and you shouldn't worry about trying to change because you actually can't. So the reality is that the messaging should be somewhere between those two with components of both. But I think what is attractive to a lot of people is really the idea that, okay, nobody wants to feel like something they did negatively impacted them. And I think that trying to explain to people that, hey, there is some personal responsibility here, which is in a way a good thing because you do have power to take control over this. Also, it's not 100% your fault. Genetics matter, environment matters, all this stuff matters.
So believe it or not, I also do not believe that there's one sort of myth online or one single type of messaging that's responsible for this chronic disease situation we find ourselves in. And I think my answer really sort of just, I guess, builds on what Layne said then. When I speak to friends or family or even engage with people online, I get the feeling that a lot of people think science is very confused and that nutrition science since the 1900s has been somewhat of a failure. So in the early 1900s, that was sort of when nutrition science, I guess, became a bit more serious. It was probably around before that in some capacity. But the diseases of the day were these nutrient deficiency related diseases like beriberi and pellagra, or infectious diseases. And so a lot of the science was focused on that. Now, through the 1900s, we've started to turn our direction more to non-communicable diseases, chronic diseases, and looking at how nutrition can impact those. And I think there's this idea out there that research has been a failure, and we actually don't know what a healthy diet looks like. And I think that couldn't be further from the truth. We don't know everything, but we know a lot. So for me, this health predicament that we find ourselves in is not a knowledge problem. And that's essentially what Layne was just speaking about there. It's more of an implementation or an action problem. And that, again, is not blaming the individual. Not at all, but we can have the best information in the world, the best dietary guidelines, but if nobody can follow them because the food environment is set up in a way where it's very hard, or they don't have the tools to navigate that food environment, then that information is not that useful. So for me, I think what I try and help people understand is that we actually do understand what a healthy dietary pattern looks like. It might just not be as absolute as people would like it to be. There's more of a theme. There's the different variations, which means people can pick and choose and find one way that works for them. It could be low fat. It could be high fat. And sometimes we get caught up in looking for what is the single best. And until we find that, nutrition science doesn't know. But I think that most people can appreciate when they hear this, that's simply not the case. And when you're a family on a budget and you have very little spare time between work and looking after kids and perhaps low levels of education, it is very difficult to adopt healthy habits in an environment that in many ways does make it easy for you to fail. So I think the myth is that nutrition science is confused. There is definitely room to learn more, but I wouldn't confuse that with having insufficient information to create enormous change here.
If you don't mind, I just want to piggyback off that real quick, Doug, if that's all right. So I love that you mentioned habits, and I love that you mentioned patterns, because really that's what we can look at is patterns. And there are many paths to Rome, whether it's, like you said, high fat, low fat, whatever. We do know what a healthy dietary pattern looks like. Now, the other thing I loved about saying habits is I like to use financial comparisons because for whatever reason, they just seem to work with people well. So when people say, well, the government failed and these recommendations failed, people didn't do the recommendations. They didn't. They ate more calories, exercised less. They ate more processed foods. They ate more carbs and fats. Like this fallacy that, oh, the government put in these low fat recommendations and the people followed them and we just got fatter. No, the government put them in. The people did not follow them. And yes, we got fatter. So what I'll always tell people is like, okay, I think the latest statistics, so this is America, I believe it's like over 70% of people could not write a check for $5,000 if they had to. Right? So they have less than $5,000 in their account. And most people have debt that's way more than that. Right? So most people are living upside down. They're in debt. They have less money than they're living on more than they earn. So in order to save money, what do you need to do on a fundamental level? Well, you need to earn more than you spend. Right? There, I just solved the debt crisis. Done. Everybody just go be rich now. Right? Like, yes, that it is not a knowledge problem. We know the knowledge to do that. The implementation is a little bit more difficult because you are talking about spending habits and spending behaviors, just like you're talking about eating habits and eating behaviors. And one thing I loved from a financial advisor, his name's Dave Ramsey, and when he coaches people, he recommends that, like, for example, if they're in debt, that they pay off the smallest debt first and then take whatever they were paying towards that once they pay it off and pay it towards the next smallest and the next one and the next one. And people will always say, well, no, you should pay off the one with the highest interest rate first. Like, that's stupid to pay off the smallest one first. And he said, well, that's if we're doing math. But if we were doing math, we wouldn't have gotten in debt in the first place. This is a behavior problem. So I liken that a lot to these sorts of behaviors and patterns that we're discussing here.
So I definitely want to, maybe now get into like some of that, like what needs to change as far as certain behaviors that can be implemented, counting calories, tracking things. But first, like you mentioned, like there is a lot of knowledge out there as far as what dietary patterns are the best for health and longevity. And you can kind of personalize that depending on, your ethics or whether you want to eat high fat, low fat, that sort of thing. But for the general population, like if you two were working with clients and you had to tell them a few like non-negotiables as far as what needed to be included in those dietary patterns, no matter how they personalize it, like what would they be?
If I was just talking very, very high level, I would say to try and minimize ultra processed foods, consume sufficient amount of fiber and protein, and have some good diversity in the diet.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Simon said. Fiber, very, very important. People, even I will be the first to say, listen, correlation studies, let's not, get too excited over correlation studies. But when you have like multiple dozens of meta-analyses that all show a dose response for fiber improving mortality and incidence of cardiovascular disease and cancer, I start to become very confident that there's probably something there, right? So I think that that's a big part of it, and a big part of why we see in a lot of cases, and Simon, of course, will speak to this, but why we see a lot of plant-based stuff do really, really well, because it's so high in fiber, right? You're getting a lot of micronutrients, you're getting a lot of fiber, which, contrary to what Paul Saladino will say, is good for you and does make a difference. As far as like other dietary patterns, I would emphasize that I might take a little bit different approach in terms of implementation, in terms of there's no non-negotiables, I would say. And here's why. If we look at like hazard ratios, for example, of what's like really the worst for you. Hazard ratios for obesity are pretty much on par with like smoking in a lot of cases. And so what I'll always say is like, if we can find a way to get total energy under control, that is going to make a huge difference for a lot of people. And right now, obesity and rates of overweight are very, very high. So what I would say is, based on the reading I've done, and I've written a lot in terms of body composition, there's no diet that emerges being better than another diet for controlling body weight, losing body fat, and keeping it off. They're all equally terrible in terms of like, if you just examine the statistics. But that's likely because you have to have some form of restriction in order to lose body fat, but you can pick the form of restriction that feels the least restrictive to you. And that's what I'll always say to people. If you want to count calories, great, but you don't have to. If you want to do low carb, great, but you don't have to. If you want to do low fat, great, but you don't have to. It just depends on what is going to feel the least restrictive for the individual so that they can be adherent to the diet, because really, compliance is the science when it comes to this stuff. And we just can't get people to be compliant. Now, if they get that big box checked, then I worry about, okay, like, are you getting enough soluble fiber and insoluble fiber and all this kind of stuff, which hopefully, again, we're getting them on good dietary patterns, which, oh, by the way, good dietary patterns are a good way to control your calorie intake as well. So it's not like these things are mutually exclusive. But I do think it's important to point out to folks that, like, hey, many roads lead to Rome, and you can pick the one that feels the easiest for you.
I might tack on something to that just to extend my response. So I definitely agree that you can lose weight on a number of different diets. And there's studies like Diet Fits, Doug, which are a great example of this, that compare a low carb. Now, some will say it's not low carb enough, but it was a low carb diet relative to a higher carb diet. And it was a 12-month study. This was work done by Christopher Gardner. And really over the year, there wasn't a lot of difference between the mean weight loss that was achieved between the two groups. But what I think was really interesting was that within each group, there was wide variation. So some people did really well on low carb, some did really well on high carb. And they tried to see, Doug, is that possibly explained by genetics or by insulin sensitivity? And it wasn't. So it kind of remains to be seen as to, can we predict whether how someone would go on a certain diet and therefore give them some information that maybe helps them. Hey, Layne, we've done this test on you and you will go better on a low carb diet. I don't think we have that information. For now, it kind of seems a little bit more like trial and error, understanding that there are different ways to lose weight. Find that way that works for you. And don't be upset when someone else loses weight a different way, because there are multiple ways to kind of get there. I do think it is important that we think about diet quality, as equal as weight loss almost. I think it's very, very important. And I know later we're going to talk about blood pressure and we're going to talk about cholesterol. But I mean, there are instances where you can lose weight, for example, and your lipids don't really budge or maybe even go the wrong way if you're constructing that diet in a certain manner. And we actually saw that in Diet Fits. We saw that in some of Kevin Hall's work. And when it comes to blood pressure, we have intervention studies showing the DASH diet, for example, dropping systolic blood pressure by about 11 millimeters of mercury, which is a big drop, which, look, you can drop your blood pressure that much through weight loss, but it's going to require a lot of weight loss. I think it's around 1 kilogram of weight loss is equivalent to about 1 millimeter of mercury drop in systolic blood pressure. So you would need to lose 11 kilos. So some of the kind of what's more important, weight or dietary pattern, really comes down to, well, how much weight and can you sustain that weight? And what does the dietary pattern look like? But I think I echo Layne in saying that you'd be fooling yourself if you thought that both of those were not important.
Yeah, and sorry, Doug, I'll add one more thing to that, because it's like he has a thought that I have a thought. And I do want to give a little bit of voice to this in terms of, because I will, so the extreme example, somebody will, well, I did carnivore, or keto, and I lost 75 pounds. My LDL cholesterol went up. You're trying to tell me I'm less healthy now than I was then. And what I would say is, no, you're probably not less healthy. Definitely losing a sizable amount of weight is going to have a bigger impact than those that fluctuation in your blood lipids. However, you are definitely not as healthy as you could have been had you lost the weight and, constructed your diet in such a way to where your blood lipids also improved. Now, if you were telling me, hey, listen, the only way I can stick to this diet is if I can have, a pound of bacon every morning. Okay, but I feel like that's going to be a pretty small subsection of people, right? But really, like Simon pointed it out, there's been a lot of play about, well, this diet, some diets work better for different people. And everybody says this, and they assume it's a physiological reason for that. I think physiology has very little to do with how people do well on diets. I think that some diets just feel really easy to some people. And you hear people say, I did intermittent fasting. I didn't even feel like I was dieting. Or I did, keto and it felt easy. And people, they'll say this, they'll say, well, I started eating more food and lost weight. No. You felt like you were eating more food because you stopped eating the standard American diet or the standard Western diet, and you eliminated, various processed foods, and you felt more satiated. So you felt like you were eating more, but trust me, you were eating less calories.
That all makes a lot of sense. And I think paying attention to both calories and quality is like the sweet spot, right? Because there's two camps, right? There's the camp that just will count calories and just kind of, if it fits your macros, if you will, and they'll kind of eat Snickers bars and they'll eat bacon, they'll eat like whatever like fits within that caloric range. And then you'll get the other extreme that they'll say, well, just because I'm eating healthy means I can eat as much food as I want. And I don't think, depending on your goals, like neither one is healthy. So like when it comes to like both of those approaches, like which one do you think is optimal for people to get started with? Because we talked about knowledge, and we don't have a lack of knowledge, it's implementation. What I found has worked best for myself, and this is purely anecdotal, is just getting a baseline of knowing like how many calories I know I need to eat. And then if I want to lose weight, if I'm losing weight, great. I maintain the caloric range and what foods are in there. If I'm not losing enough weight, I can adjust accordingly and adjust my activity. So how do you both feel about, like, what's the first step? Is it focusing on quality or is it focusing on calories?
Do you mind if I take this first, Simon?
You go for it.
Okay. So I think, again, not mutually exclusive, but if we're going to take those two kind of choices, I think really like where you start just depends on the individual. And like, again, what's going to feel easiest for them. So trying out something and seeing, hey, does this work? Do you, some people, like for me, tracking calories, it does not feel cumbersome in the least. It costs me an extra 3 minutes a day. You know what I mean? In terms of like putting stuff in my app and whatnot. I mean, I'm from the school of 20 years ago. I had to walk around the grocery store with the complete book of food counts and like figure out, hey, what's a high protein food? What's a low carb food? That sort of thing. But for some people, I don't make the assumption that everybody's like me. But for some people, that sort of thing feels extremely burdensome. And they would rather just say, well, you know what? I'm just going to reduce my consumption of processed food and limit my portion size. So again, I think that both of those are very reasonable. And, when it comes to, people probably assume I'm coming from the side of IFYM of, just eat whatever hits your macros and your calories. And what I always say is, the caveat that nobody ever talks about that I always put in was like, you should get enough fiber. It's going to be difficult to get enough fiber if all you're eating is Snickers bars. You know what I mean? So I think that's the one caveat. Now you'll have people who just completely go berserk and they're like, well, I could just do Skittles, whey protein powder, a multivitamin, and a fiber supplement. And I'm like, you're an idiot and you're missing the point. Like this is the extremism that is not helpful.
So I guess my approach to this is similar. I do like to educate about diet quality first a little bit and teach people about the broad themes, diets that are low saturated fat, are high in fiber, and are low in ultra processed foods. What does that look like? There are many different variations. Which one, I want to meet people where they are. Which one is something that someone feels like they would enjoy? There's no point doing something that you're going to do for 2 weeks. It needs to be something that you can do long term. And then with regards to calorie counting, Doug, for me, I see many different tools out there. Calorie counting is one. Maybe fasting for someone is a tool. And often these get bashed a lot. And, personally, if I was to use my personal experience, I could probably bash calorie counting because I don't count calories to maintain my body weight. And I manage my body weight pretty easy with some basic principles. But just because I haven't had to personally count calories doesn't mean that it's not useful for other people. And it's funny because we could think about something else in society. I've got a beach towel here right now. And there are many things in society that certain people derive value from more than other people. And this beach towel that I've got sitting here, we don't demonize it because people with fair skin probably don't derive as much value from it as someone with tan skin who is going to go to the beach more often. The person that has the fair skin is probably very acutely aware that they burn more easily, they know the risks, and perhaps they don't use the towel. But we don't demonize it because that towel is going to have some great utility for people that do enjoy going to the beach. So, that's how I like to think about these things. There are lots of different tools in the toolbox. I think get diet quality, understand what diet quality actually means, find something that you enjoy and can sustain. And then if weight loss is your goal, sure, tap into any of the myriad of tools out there that can help you get into a calorie deficit and lose weight in a way where it feels as easy as possible.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, I'm going to piggyback one more time. People would probably assume that Simon and I would disagree on a lot of stuff. Because a lot of my content is, saying things like sugar is not fattening independent of a calorie deficit, or, this nutrient, processed foods are fattening, in general. And I'll say, no, actually they're not. It's just the calories, that sort of thing. So people will assume that I'm promoting those foods. And I'm like, no, we need to be careful. And when we are saying what works, we need to be honest about why it works, right? because misinformation always has unintended consequences. And what I've seen, a lot of that is just the rise in the amount of eating disorders and like food anxiety. Basically, a lot of people are scared to eat anything because they're like, well, this expert says this is going to kill me, and this expert says this is going to kill me, and that sort of thing. And I'm probably a little bit biased coming from like the physique competition area, where I worked with a lot of competitors who had so many crazy disordered eating habits because they had these impressions of various foods that honestly, they started being healthier when I was like, hey, you can have some processed food. Like, it's not going to mess you up to just have a little bit of it as long as you're controlling for energy intake. Now, would I recommend that you form the basis of your diet from processed foods? Absolutely not. But if we start fear-mongering individual ingredients, like that will have unintended consequences. And same thing with sugar, right? Like people have used the demonization of sugar to be like, well, fruit has sugar, so that means you shouldn't have fruit. And you got people like, that dentist on Instagram saying that, just limit it to 3 pieces of fruit, doesn't mention, berries versus bananas or whatever, and says, your liver can't handle any else. It's going to make your liver fat. And so these are some of the unintended consequences of misinformation, even though that misinformation is probably well intended by a lot of people.
And just to add to that, Doug, which is in many ways echoing what Layne's saying there, I often say that consistency is far more important over time than any one particular meal or snack. So, for example, I eat donuts and pizza and stuff. It's not making up the bulk of my calories, but when I eat it, I'm not feeling shame or guilt. I understand that what really matters is, what does my dietary pattern, coming back to dietary pattern, look like the majority of the time over decades? And when we zoom back out, that takes a lot of that guilt and shame away from eating. That's not to be confused with the message of go out and just eat as much donuts and pizza as you want. We have studies that have looked at ultra processed versus unprocessed foods. And sure, if you base your whole diet off them, they are hyperpalatable and you probably will overconsume calories if you're not counting them. It's harder to fill up on fewer calories when your diet is made up of a lot of ultra processed foods. But I kind of share Layne's view that sometimes we kind of generate too much fear over a single food or a single nutrient. And I much prefer to zoom back out, think about health outcomes and dietary patterns. I think it's a lot more informative and instructive and empowering.
We got to think about individuals too, because I've had athletes who are maintaining their body weight on 4,000 calories a day who are like desperately trying to not consume processed foods because they're like, oh, it's going to make me unhealthy. And I'm like, bro, you're like 8% body fat. You do 5 hours of exercise a day. You're in incredible shape. You got great blood lipids and insulin sensitivity, all this kind of stuff. Like, you're telling me that like you're having gastrointestinal distress because you feel so full from these, because all you're eating is unprocessed food. I'm like, bro, have some Skittles. You'll be fine. Trust me. And I think that this is some of the problem with the messaging is when people say, well, this food is healthy and this food is unhealthy. The dosage makes the poison.
Right. And I'm so glad that you guys brought up the fact that you agree on a lot of this, because on paper, you would look at what you both eat, maybe some of your content, and you're like, all right, if there's a conversation, this is going to be a heated debate. They're going to disagree on everything. But I knew otherwise because I just know both of your backgrounds and what you how your approach is like. And the reason I wanted to have you both on here is because I could have Simon on here and people would be like, well, he's just saying that because he wants people to eat, less animals and wants what's best for the environment. He has an underlying agenda. And then if I just had Layne on here, people could say, well, he's just trying to get people to use his app more and buy his supplements and that sort of thing. And I want to point out, there's so many common themes in what you guys believe in. And I think people are really going to appreciate this. And, one of the things that I heard early on as a trainer is, I'm not going to eat that. It's too fattening. When what they were eating had no fat in it. They just had got caught up in the word fat. And anything that had anything to do with sugar, carbs was going to automatically make them fat. Now, one of the things I see a lot is, I want to lose weight, I'm just going to cut carbs. And then what I see in the gym is their workouts suffer, they're fatigued, their energy's down. And so there's all kinds of side effects that come with these things. And it's no secret, we've touched on this a couple of times, that keto is like in right now. Like when people want to like lose weight, get in shape, they're like, I'm just going to do keto. And I guess my question for you both, since we have touched on this and I do want to kind of go deeper into this while we're talking about it, is like, why are so many people seeing success with keto? And what are some of the long-term problems that they're not thinking about?
I think there's a few reasons that they're seeing success. It might get boiled down to one particular thing. Often people in this diet camp perhaps removed seed oils, and they put the success down to the removal of seed oils. I'm not of that view. I respectfully disagree with that view. But I think ultimately, Doug, when someone adopts a ketogenic diet, one of the biggest things they are removing is ultra-processed foods, which make up 50-60% of the average person's calories. So that's a great thing. We have to acknowledge that most people that are doing ketogenic diets are eating whole foods, unless you're going out and eating the kind of keto labeled ultra processed foods. There are quite a few of those now. So that's a great thing. And the diet usually contains quite a bit of protein. That's satiating. And as we alluded to earlier, there are going to be people, we have evidence of this, that do well on a low carb diet, and it does encourage a calorie deficit, and they do lose weight. So that's kind of my high level view of why people are seeing success. Now, my question back, and this can be an open one to both of you, is, are people constructing that low carb ketogenic diet in the best manner that also considers their long-term health? And Layne alluded to this earlier. And I think if they're losing a lot of weight, then there's no arguing that they're in a much better position than they were, say, 6 months earlier with an extra 30 pounds. Absolutely. But I would question whether, relative to constructing that low carb diet in a slightly different way, reducing saturated fat, for example, and swapping it for polyunsaturated fats, which we know has beneficial effects on lipids and actually on outcome data reduces the risk of coronary heart disease. Is that going to be a way of them doing this low carb diet that also reduces their long-term risk of these chronic diseases that have very long latency periods? They don't just develop overnight. And I think sometimes there's a lot of stock being put into the short-term change and in their health, and I think that's great. But we should also consider, what data do we have about longer-term health outcomes? And so when I'm speaking, and I work with a number of people that are on low-carb diets, Doug, that have heard me speak about this, and for whatever reason they've seen their lipids go to astronomical levels, their physicians are concerned, and with some dietary changes, moving people away from the more saturated fat animal products, leaning more into fish, or leaning more into plant protein and nuts and seeds and avocado, for example, and that person can maintain the low carbohydrate diet, keep the weight off, and still enjoy their food, hopefully, and improve their lipids. So I guess that's my kind of roundabout way of answering that.
Yeah, I'll take it from a little bit different perspective. So why are so many people doing well on it? I don't think people are doing that much better than other diets. I think that when you get into anything that's really tribal, you just don't hear from the people who don't do well. Because if they come out and say, hey, ketogenic diet actually sucked for me and I hated it, they're going to get people telling them, you just did it wrong. Or you just didn't do keto hard enough, those sorts of things. And you see this actually some of the most vitriol I've seen is from the carnivore community. If somebody comes out and says, I did carnivore and, my GI was messed up and, I had this and that, they get absolutely skewered online by that community. And so what happens? Well, they get bullied and they decide, if it didn't work for them, they just go, yeah, well, I'm just going to try the next thing and keep that to myself. This is selection bias to a certain degree as well. So I think that's one thing. I think Simon touched on most of the rest, right? One thing that I would also say is a lot of people like the low carb diets because they tend to get some really rapid weight loss quickly, which is really encouraging to folks. There is data to suggest that if people lose quite a bit of weight early in a weight loss period, that they're more likely to keep it off. And I don't think there's nothing physiological with that. That is just purely they buy in. They're like, oh, okay, yeah, this thing actually works, right? again, it's important to understand why things work. Well, you lose a significant amount of body water on a ketogenic diet. In fact, estimates are anywhere from 1 to 3 kilograms of body water, which is really funny when these pro-low carb folks will put up meta-analyses saying, see, the ketogenic diet was better. And it's like 6 months and it's better by like a kilogram. And I'm like, yeah, that's actually no difference because it's water, because they didn't actually measure body composition. So, but again, not saying it can't work. It can absolutely work. And I think a great example of somebody who promotes, a kind of like reasonable keto is somebody I've known for a long time, which is Dom D'Agostino, which he will say, hey, probably should eat some vegetables. Probably like make sure most of your carbs are coming from vegetables or, even some fruits, like berries and stuff he'll advise. And he talked too about how I think it was his sister. I could get this wrong. So I apologize if he listens and I get the wrong relative, but one of his relatives did a ketogenic diet and put on 25 pounds. You can definitely do wrong keto. And I think Simon kind of hinted at it. Ultra-processed foods are ultra-processed foods, no matter how you want to slice it, okay? So I chuckle greatly when I go to a grocery store and I see a keto ice cream that has more calories than the actual ice cream. And I'm like, okay, we're really missing the point here, fellas. You know what I mean? Like what are we doing out here, man? It's just like, if it tastes that good, guess what? You're going to overeat on it. And, people are out here plowing down tubs of, ketogenic or vegan ice cream, as Simon alluded to, thinking that it's healthy because it's this one particular thing. And it's like, no, you're truly missing the point of this.
And just to add one more thing, Doug, another reason why I think there is some attraction to low carb diets from what I've seen, and this is more so I see with people that are kind of not willing to engage with some of that research if I was to share about sort of more thoughtfully constructing a low carb diet. I think it is that dietary preference initially, at least initially, was attractive because, hey, all of a sudden, these foods that they thought were not great for their long-term health, like red meat, well, all of a sudden now you can double down and just eat as much as you want. And that's attractive, right? And then when you start that and you get that, the loss of glycogen and you see some weight come off, well, all of a sudden it's working. And so you believe that, this is effective. But what we know in reality, and again, red meat, I don't know if we're going to get into that, but exposure level matters. It's not this binary black or white thing, poison, great for you. No, there is a more nuanced approach to this. And, you'll see lots of studies see no difference in health outcomes with red meat. Well, there's not much contrast between upper and lower, and that community doesn't eat a lot of red meat. And then you see another one, like, for example, some of the American ones, and you're comparing very low red meat to say 180 grams a day, and you do see a difference. So again, unless you're trained in science, you might just be very confused by that and think that nutrition science doesn't understand, but really those results are explainable. If you get into the methods and you understand the cohort and, you look at the actual details, you can explain why there are different results. And so, yeah, I think that's another sort of reason why people are attracted to the low carb diet is you can double down on these foods.
Yeah, and I think I'm thinking of a moment on the Joe Rogan podcast where Paul Saladino was pontificating on, why saturated fat isn't bad for you and reference the Minnesota coronary study. And I think people really have a hard time understanding the concept of lifetime exposure risk. And I say this as somebody who, when I got to graduate school, is circa 2004, one of the new prevailing wisdoms was, at least in the protein community, because I'm a high protein guy, that's my bias, and I'm happy to admit that. But the prevailing wisdom was that, well, it's not the LDL cholesterol, it's the LDL to HDL ratio. And I would say I was pretty consistent with that up until about just after 2010. And then I kind of started reading some more studies and was like, and at this point I'm like, nope, LDL cholesterol definitely matters. And HDL seems to be a lot more passive and just indicates, kind of overall health. But the concept of lifetime exposure risk really escapes a lot of people. So, in the Minnesota coronary study, most of those people that were examined, it was a 5-year study, but most of those people weren't on the diets for 5 years. It was like 2 years, and it was people in their 40s. Well, you're just not going to have a lot of heart attacks for people in their 40s, especially just examining 2 years. And, we're talking about lifetime exposure risk again. So when I say that, we know that LDL cholesterol, penetrates the endothelium. We know it basically, if you have higher LDL, you can have higher LDL oxidation. And so why don't we see that difference in a study like that, where it's over 2 years? Well, that's like saying, okay, Simon, you're going to invest in something that's going to get a 6% return, and I'm going to invest in something that's going to get a 7% return, and we're going to check in 2 years and see who has more money. Well, I'll have a little bit more money, but it really won't be statistically significant, most likely, right? But in 40 years, guess who's going to have a lot more money? I'm going to have a lot more money because it's compounding and it's a lifetime exposure, if you will. And so what really changed it for me was looking at the Mendelian randomization studies, because there you're basically getting a lifetime randomized control trial, looking at these different exposure levels of LDL, and you see, basically a linear association of LDL with incidence of heart disease and mortality. And so to me, after I saw those, I'm like, well, got to change my opinion on that.
So I think this is a good opportunity to segue into the factors that contribute to elevated cholesterol, risk of cancer, elevated blood pressure, because you hear a lot when people are looking to reduce their cholesterol, reduce their blood pressure, reduce the risk of cancer, like, oh, I'm just going to cut out red meat, or I'm going to stop eating a lot of saturated fat. And we've talked about quality, and I personally believe that quality does matter. Like, there's a big difference between eating a piece of deep fried chicken than eating a chicken breast. There's a big difference between eating a cheeseburger than eating a nice grass-fed, grass-finished filet mignon. I think there's a big difference there. So when it comes to the risk factors and when it comes to elevated blood pressure, cholesterol, risk of disease, what do you believe is more important? Is it lifestyle? Is it the overconsumption of calories? Or is it the type of calories, whether it be red meat, saturated fat, etc., that is the biggest driver for determining these things?
How many calories are we over consuming by versus how much red meat is being, it's everything exists on a continuum. That's the difficulty in answering some of these questions. People really want, you're asking the right question, but people want black and white answers. And the fact is that this stuff is all nuanced, right? What I will say is I think that overall energy toxicity is a really important consideration. I think that after that, probably fiber is my next thing that I think is probably the next most important. And then if I had to get down into another nutrient, I think saturated fat, limiting saturated fat is probably a really important thing to do. But people will hear that and say, well, you're saying I need to cut out all red meat? No, there are some studies that kind of suggest that this is where it's so hard to tease apart, because dietary patterns versus individual nutrients. But most people who are eating a high, and this might be where we get into the differences in opinion between Simon and I, but most people who eat up, a higher red meat diet, they're not getting that from lean cuts of meat and that sort of thing. They're getting it from, what you talked about, Doug, and that's difficult to tease apart. There was a really cool study, a cohort study, where they looked at meat intake. And first off, it seems like processed meat is, I'm kind of shifting my opinion that regardless of calories, that probably is not very good for you. As far as red meat intake, they looked at stratifying, and I'm sure you know the study, Simon, so if I misquote it, please let me know. But they kind of stratified it into high, medium, and low intakes of red meat, as well as high, medium, and low levels of fruit and vegetables. And basically found that when they got to high levels of fruits and vegetables, pretty much it didn't matter so much how much red meat they were eating. It seemed like it was more about getting in enough fiber and enough fruits and vegetables. But I think that also speaks to the idea of dietary patterns, right? People who eat a lot of red meat usually are eating a lot of processed, like you talked about, burgers and whatnot, and they're not eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. So again, is red meat like a risk factor for cardiovascular disease? Probably insofar as like the saturated fat content, because even like a filet mignon or something like that is still going to have a decent amount of saturated fat in it, but obviously less than something like a T-bone or a ribeye or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I might add a couple points on there. I think generally I agree that fruits and vegetables can attenuate some risk. So I think that study, if it's the one that I'm thinking about, it was a Canadian cohort. I think it was Maximova or Max something was the first author. And there's probably a couple of ways to interpret that study. But firstly, I guess exposure high and low, these are terms that are relative in different studies. So I think that's always important. I think in this study, it was about 70 grams a day was the average. And the kind of standard deviation from memory was like 300 or so. And so that high group was over 500 grams a day, but it didn't really there wasn't enough data in there to kind of determine, well, how many people were over that 100 grams a day north of that? Were most of the people in the over 500 grams a day closer to 500 grams a week, or were they having a kilogram a week? So I'd say that's the first kind of comment I have. The second is that it looked like the high red meat seemed to increase risk, but then when you introduce high fruit and veg, that attenuated that risk. So I guess just to put that into perspective, we're saying that the red meat did increase risk. There were some properties that seemed to increase risk, which then was attenuated by beneficial properties of fruits and veg. There's probably a couple ways to interpret that there. But I think, again, if you look at that was a cancer outcome, I believe, it pulled the different types of cancer. So it was looking at an aggregate. I think it would have been very informative to just look at, say, colorectal cancer, which we know does associate a bit more with red meat intake. That's not to say that there is any real problems with that study. I think it's interesting. I think it does tell us that the addition of fruit and veg to a diet can perhaps offset some of the increased risk that may come with unprocessed red meat with regards to cancer. And then with regards, because we're kind of jumping around a little bit here, but with regards to cholesterol and cardiovascular disease risk, again, a lot of this comes down to the individual. Where's their cholesterol levels at? I think the average cholesterol levels in America are at about 125 milligrams per deciliter. And if we look at Mendelian, if we look at the drug trials and observational, particularly some observational studies that are out there, you need to get that down to 100 milligrams per deciliter at a sort of level where you're not seeing a whole lot of atherosclerosis. Again, lifetime exposure matters. If you just do that late in the game, it's not going to reduce risk as much. And down to, say, 70 milligrams per deciliter, you really don't see much atherosclerosis at all. And in the drug trials, that's sort of the level where you start to see some regression of atherosclerosis. So again, average cholesterol levels are about 125. They need to get down to 100 or a little bit lower, ideally, if we want to see some reduction in coronary heart disease. And so I agree that fatty cuts of red meat are going to be worse than lean, but there is some randomized controlled trial data. There's a study by Bergeron et al. I'm sure Layne's seen that one. And they actually really interestingly wanted to look at whether there was a difference between lean red meat, lean white meat, and vegetable plant protein within the context of a diet that was there was two arms, both high saturated fat and low saturated fat. And what they saw is in both of those arms, even if it was a background diet that was low saturated fat, so the saturated fat between those three different groups, lean red meat, lean white meat, and plant protein, was the same, Doug, they still saw a significant reduction in ApoB, which is a bit more of a specific, I guess, marker than LDL cholesterol. We don't need to go into the rabbit hole of what that is, but they did see a greater benefit with the addition of plant protein in the diet. And that's probably, in that circumstance, given saturated fat was controlled for similar across the groups, it's probably dietary cholesterol, which again is a confusing topic. It doesn't affect your cholesterol levels to anywhere near the same degree as saturated fat does, but it does play a role and probably explains that. So I do, my bias is looking at, okay, what are average cholesterol levels out there? And there is, the greatest benefit if you're going to be making a substitution is taking red meat and eating more plant protein. And I'd like to see a trial do that with seafood, with fish as well, because that would be interesting to kind of see the magnitude of effect there.
So I will push back slightly on the Maximov study. So I would just have a different interpretation possibly of the data, which it is possible that there is, some effect of red meat, increasing the risk of cancer. It's also possible that as you increase red meat consumption, the consumption of other foods in the diet that are beneficial go down. And so it's possible that it's less about, what they are consuming versus what they aren't. But again, this is one of the limitations of nutritional science research, which I say limitation, it doesn't mean it's garbage, ladies and gentlemen on Twitter. It just means there's limitations. So I do concede the fact that it is entirely possible that is, just like you said, Simon, that there is something inherent in red meat that increases the risk, independent of saturated fat. But I think that trying to tease it out of that trial is difficult to say. And it could be, again, that people who are more likely to eat more red meat are also more likely to have other dietary habits that could explain the difference. The other trial, you went over it. It was a really cool study. I reviewed it, and I think it was a great study. What I would say is there were differences in dietary cholesterol that probably explained quite a bit. But at the same time, to your credit, if you're eating red meat, you're going to be getting more dietary cholesterol than you are eating plant protein. So I think what I would say is that, again, this is probably my, being a stickler for, just wanting people to understand why. So not necessarily that there's something, inherently evil about red meat or whatnot, but more so that, hey, if you're going to choose to eat red meat, you really need to understand that if you're going to do that, you probably need to really focus on getting your saturated fat and total cholesterol down from other sources as well. Because if you're going to make that trade-off, guess what? Probably don't need to be eating ice cream at night. You know what I mean? It just depends on what your overall diet quality looks like. So the other thing I want to say, and I don't know really where to slide this in the conversation, but I think one of the things that people struggle with is I think a lot of people have this idea that there's this one perfect diet that if we just ate this diet, it's going to fix every problem. And I think there are dietary, we've talked about, there are dietary patterns that appear to be very beneficial. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The best diet for preventing sarcopenia might not be the best diet for cancer. The best diet for preventing cancer might not be the best diet for heart disease. The best diet for heart disease might not be the best diet for Alzheimer's. So I think that the dietary patterns that are probably the best to prevent some of those non-communicable diseases are probably pretty similar. But when we get granular with it, there may be some subtle differences. And I think people need to accept that. And hopefully over time, we'll understand those more so that people who are more prone to certain diseases can tailor it a little bit. And then one more thing to add to Simon's point, and just to emphasize how much I am willing to change my mind with new data, is I have always run slightly high cholesterol. So I've always run slightly high LDL, anywhere from 125 to 160, Simon. And that's been consistent whether or not I was eating less than 7% of calories from saturated fat. I could modify it a little bit, I could get it down a little bit, but I never really could, get it much under that. So I actually just this year started taking a low-dose statin, because I became so convinced by the data that I'm all right, I'm 40 now. If we're going to get started, now's the time to get started. And I think that that's probably important for people to hear, because some people would probably look at me and go, well, you're Ph.D. in nutrition. You should be able to sort all this out and not be supporting big pharma. And it's well, not everyone can do that, because there are some genetic things that matter, especially when it comes to LDL cholesterol.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, in that instance, if someone's cholesterol has been elevated for a long period, no matter what dietary changes they're making, then there's likely a genetic component that is driving that. And certainly, statins have been proven to be very, very effective. And the earlier you get on them and the greater your lifetime exposure is to reduce cholesterol, as we kind of spoke to before, the better. Back to that Bergeron study, one other thing that I think is important there is that study controlled for saturated fat. I think in a real life substitution, if you were to swap out red meat for increasing some plant protein, one of the side benefits of this, other than the reduction in dietary cholesterol, and probably more important, is that naturally, depending on, hoping that that person doesn't go and sort of guzzle down a lot of palm oil or coconut oil, naturally they're reducing the saturated fat in their diet and increasing the fiber in their diet in that trade. So we'd expect the magnitude of reduction in ApoB or LDL cholesterol to be even greater in a kind of real life scenario there. And to come back to your question, Doug, which was, what's more important, weight or these changes? Again, depends how much weight is someone going to lose. I think if someone's losing, 20, 30, 40 pounds, that's probably going to be greater than the dietary changes. But if we're talking about, 5, 10 pounds, maybe diet is just as influential, if not more. And there was a series of intervention trials done with a diet called the Portfolio diet, Doug. It's something that Dr. David Jenkins in Canada kind of led. And these trials, what's interesting about them is they were looking at a dietary pattern and how can this affect cholesterol levels in people that had very elevated cholesterol levels. I think the average cholesterol LDL was about 180, so super high. And in these interventions, at least the initial ones, they were looking at what happens in a weight maintenance intervention. So when you have a control, which was just adopting a sort of standard low saturated fat diet as recommended by a physician, you had a low intensity statin group, and then you had what they called Portfolio diet, which really was it was more about what you're adding to your diet. So there was the addition of plant protein, a lot of fiber, a lot of soy foods, which have some properties that can help reduce cholesterol. And this was 4 weeks, Doug. And again, this is weight maintenance. And in that trial, they saw that LDL cholesterol fell. Again, the higher your cholesterol is, when you make these dietary changes, the bigger it will fall. You've got more room to move there. They reduced their LDL cholesterol from 180 to about 130, so 50 milligrams per deciliter in just 4 weeks. And they actually measured ApoB in that trial as well, which fell about 30 or 40 milligrams per deciliter, which is huge given that there was no weight loss. So I don't want to understate the kind of potential benefits that are up for grabs, but when you are making substitutions that do lower saturated fat and increase fiber, they are big levers. And also the addition of polyunsaturated fats, we know, have the opposite effect of saturated fats. They have beneficial effects on your lipids. So adding in the marine sources, be it fish, be it algae and nuts and seeds and those foods, these changes can be very, very impactful on your cholesterol levels, really reduce your risk of coronary heart disease, which is a major cause of death and or total mortality today. And then with other sort of risk factors like blood pressure, Doug, again, losing weight is going to have a huge impact. There was a really good American Heart Association, I can give you the link to this. It was their clinical guidelines for hypertension, which has a beautiful table that lays out kind of the relative impacts of, say, losing weight or adopting a healthy diet or reducing alcohol consumption on blood pressure. And I think I mentioned that before. Every kilogram you lose, you can drop your systolic blood pressure by about 1 millimeter of mercury. And so if you have a lot of weight to lose, you can certainly lower your blood pressure a long way. They compared that to what happens with a DASH diet, this kind of sort of plant-forward diet with low-fat dairy and lean meat. What happens with that in the context of not losing weight? And you could expect around a reduction of about 11 millimeters of mercury for people that have hypertension. And so the table kind of lays out all of the different relative effects on blood pressure. But I think the main point here is that it shouldn't be about what's more important, losing weight or adopting a healthy diet or reducing alcohol. All of these can be tinkered with. And if someone has a blood pressure of, say, 140 or 150 millimeters of mercury systolic and we want to get them back down to 120, they have 20 or 30 points they need to go. And 10 of that might come from losing weight. 5 or 10 of that may come from changing the foods on their plate, and some might come from alcohol. And it's a bit of a kind of team game there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that you both like dove deep into that. And I think there's been a common theme in that, while there are certain dietary patterns that have been studied to support what's best for like longevity, it all comes back to the individual and what works best for them. And Simon, you touched on plant protein. And I think when people who aren't vegan hear plant protein, they're like, ooh, like, oh, does this mean I have to go like plant-based? And really it's just eating more nuts, seeds, beans, quinoa, like lentils, stuff like that are decent sources of plant protein. And I think it's a good time to kind of, as we wrap up this conversation, to get into probably the one that I've been most excited to chat about, and that is plant protein versus animal protein. Because Simon, I know a lot of your audience is plant-based, and they're going to want to know, like, there's been this big question, like, can you get enough protein on a plant-based diet? And for me, when I think of a quality source of protein, and Simon, you might disagree, is that I've always thought of it as like what has the highest amount of protein for the lowest amount of calories. So for me, it was always egg whites, chicken breasts, like fish, like stuff like that, because I used to kind of follow the more bodybuilding diet, so to speak. So I guess to punt this back to you guys, like, what is a better source of protein for most people? Is it animal protein or is it plant protein? And how do you decipher like what the best quality is?
So I think a lot of people are going to be kind of surprised at what I say based on their perceptions of who I am.
Be careful, Layne. Be careful.
So I think the question, can you get enough protein from plant sources? Well, I guess first question is enough for what, right? So if the question is, can you get a sufficient amount of protein to be healthy? Yeah, absolutely. Because you don't really need a ton of protein to be healthy. Now, high protein diets may have some beneficial effects in terms of weight management, satiety benefits, less so the thermic effect of food. There is something there. I don't think it's a huge benefit, if I'm being honest. But if we're talking about like, kind of more my audience, which, body composition based, how do I get as jacked as possible? You can still get plenty jacked on a plant-based diet. You absolutely can. In terms of getting high quality protein, one, it depends on, are you just straight up no animal sources whatsoever? Because if you're somebody who says, well, I'll do dairy and fish and, eggs, oh, well, then you're like, there's no question. Like, that's easy. Those are some of the best protein sources there are in terms of quality. And then if it's, well, I'm not going to have any whatsoever, yeah, I think you can still get enough. The difficulty on a plant-based diet with somebody who isn't willing to supplement with an isolated plant protein powder for somebody looking to build as much muscle as possible, so this specific group of people, the problem becomes, especially during a calorie restriction, is getting that amount of protein while also limiting calories, because most of those plant sources of protein are going to have, carbohydrates or fats along with them. So, but can you do it? Absolutely. Might take a little bit more planning, combining protein sources, whatnot. Typically what I recommend, if I've got, people who are competing in bodybuilding and they're straight up vegan, I'll say, well, let's get a soy protein powder, a soy protein isolate. We'll throw that on top. If we can get, actually probably the best source of isolated plant protein is potato protein isolate, because it's very high in essential amino acids, very high in leucine, actually very similar to whey protein, to be honest. But it's just really difficult to find. But yeah, if you do that, yeah. And then the other thing is, even if you're having suboptimal plant-based sources, and when I say that, like things like wheat, things that are lower in leucine, lower in branched chain amino acids, the direct research I did for my Ph.D. showed that, hey, even if you're consuming these sources of protein, if you get enough total protein, you will get the same benefits. The question really is more of a problem for people who have difficulty eating enough total protein. If your total protein is low, then the source of protein you choose becomes much more important if you're on a low total protein. If you're on a high protein diet, if you're eating, 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, probably doesn't matter what source of protein you're eating, to be quite frank.
You're not going to get the controversy that you may have wanted, Doug. So I think there's no debating that if your protein intake is not optimal, then animal protein is superior. If we're talking about a third world developing country that has food access problems, is not getting enough total energy, then animal protein is going to be superior to plant protein based on the amino acid content and the sort of protein content per calorie. I share Layne's view that if you're getting optimal amount of total protein, then it probably doesn't matter too much. And so I think the research shows, exceeding 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram, you could probably go a little bit higher than that if that suits you, is going to be optimal for someone who's wanting to build lean muscle and strength. There are a few different trials, particularly one last year that directly looked at vegans and omnivores. We could go into that if you wanted to. And then for elderly, which I think we need much more research here, Doug. I think the general consensus is that the RDA is too low at 0.8 grams per kilogram. I think most of the researchers like Stuart Phillips and others that I've spoken to, they really think that 1.2 to 1.3 grams per kilogram should be the minimum amount that someone that's 60, 65 or north of that is consuming to avoid some of these age-related diseases like sarcopenia and osteopenia and osteoporosis. The question that I think we need more research on is, as someone gets older, and I'm just telling Layne things that he absolutely knows, people develop what is called anabolic resistance. So it can be harder to build muscle and maintain muscle. Well, not it can be, it is. And the question that becomes important there is, well, is there a difference between plant and animal protein for that population? I'd love to see more trials looking at that and looking at actual outcomes. And I think that we will see that because now researchers are starting to sort of delve into this area a little bit more deeply. So overall, I think total protein, definitely for healthy adults, if you're hitting that 1.6 grams per kilogram, look, it's definitely achievable on a plant-exclusive diet. I know you said, Doug, that most of my listeners are plant-based, but plant-based can be quite broad. Many of them are not plant-exclusive, so many are following a sort of very plant-forward Mediterranean diet or a pescatarian diet or vegetarian. But for those that are doing plant-exclusive, it absolutely is achievable. Now, when you drop calories, and I have worked with a number of people, you need to get creative. And Layne alluded to this, there are some other plant-based foods out there that provide higher protein per calorie, like textured vegetable protein or seitan, and of course an isolated plant protein powder. You're going to need to tap into those if you're severely restricting your calories and you want to maintain protein. And arguably in that situation, you want your protein intake to be probably a little bit higher anyway to help preserve some of that lean muscle. So it's all absolutely possible. I think a lot of the time the debate around whether it's possible or not is a little bit silly. If someone's motivated to adopt a plant-exclusive diet for whatever reason that is, then I think we should be, helping them, encouraging them to do it in a way where they are able to achieve optimal protein, meeting them where they are. And I've certainly worked with many people and seen that it is, absolutely possible.
I was just going to say, just to piggyback off of that, like one of the things that I learned, I guess, through just basic nutrition stuff when I was younger was that, like, in order for a protein to be deemed as being quality, it had to contain all the essential amino acids. And I think that might be a good point. Like, as I know we only have a few minutes left, but maybe to try and hit on is that old news that for protein to be quality, it has to contain all the essential amino acids? Because that's one of the pushbacks you'll hear from people on plant protein is that, well, they don't have all the essential amino acids. How can that be quality protein?
They do have all the essential amino acids. It's more about, is it in a balance that is going to allow you to get enough of that essential amino acid? So I don't know of any plant source that's like utterly and completely devoid of of essential amino acid. Maybe there's one out there that I'm not familiar with, but even like wheat, for example, is just really low in lysine. And there's others that are low in some of the sulfur amino acids and whatnot. So you are getting some. And so then it becomes about combining different sources to achieve that. I do want to go back real quick because I'm going to have to jump off here before too long. And then Simon can respond as I'm off in the ether. You brought up a good point about the elderly, Simon. And I think one of the other things to consider is elderly people have a really hard time getting enough total protein because a lot of them just don't, like their ability to masticate just is not as good. Like they're not be able to chew as much. And like you said, anabolic resistance and whatnot. So there's where, again, like the quality of the protein, and quality to me is basically digestibility, PDCAS, you pick your score, whatever. I think PDCAS is decent enough. And then, in terms of anabolism, your branched chain amino acid or leucine content. And I will say for people, who are either like elderly, plant exclusive, or calorie restricted plant exclusive, this may be a case where actually adding supplemental branched chain amino acids or supplemental essential amino acids, if you're, again, for whatever reason, against consuming I can't imagine who'd be against consuming an isolated plant protein, but also be okay with consuming branched chain amino acids. But if you are that person, that's one situation where supplemental branched chains may actually be useful to enhance kind of that protein quality of the diet you're consuming. But the one thing I will add before we stick our flag in the sand and say that, 1.6 grams of protein is enough to maximize muscle building is it is difficult to kind of work some of this stuff out because muscle growth is a very slow process. And really, it's very difficult to get studies on resistance trainers that are more than 12 weeks long. And so to tease apart small differences, so I'll give you an example. We actually saw differences in muscle mass in rats who were fed different sources of protein that were completely isonitrogenous. They were just different sources of protein. So we did see a difference in muscle mass between like a whey group and a wheat group over 11 weeks. Well, 11 weeks of a rat's lifetime is a long time. I think it's like an eighth of their lifespan. So it's like, it is possible that there may be some, but again, it was a small difference. I think it was like an 8% difference. So it is possible, but again, if this is a concern for a very small amount of people, I mean, essentially bodybuilders or elite athletes who really want to maximize their level of lean body mass. And there was a recent meta-regression analysis that basically projected that there is somewhat of a dose response to protein that may go up to like 3.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. But again, I think if your goal isn't to be the most muscular human you possibly can be, I think 1.6 is completely fine.
On the scoring systems, the DAS and PDCAS, particularly the DAS, I think it's important to understand. Often we see online, you'll see proteins ranked by quality. And those scoring systems, I think people need to understand how they're actually formulated. So first of all, it's feeding different foods to animals, usually pigs, animal proteins and plant proteins. And when it comes to the plant proteins, they're often using raw plant protein. So you can imagine raw beans, for example, dried beans. Of course, we cook our beans, which we know increases digestibility. So the sort of difference in digestibility, it is believed that it has been overstated, the difference between animal and plant protein, because of the way that the plant proteins are prepared in many of these different analyses. Now, we have seen more studies in recent years look at properly prepared plant proteins, and you see that digestibility of digestibility is actually far, far less between animal and plant protein. The second is that those scores, the DS score, they're not just digestibility. They also score that protein coming back to what we mentioned before about the amino acid ratio. So they look at what is called the limiting amino acid. And so if a certain protein contains one of these 9 essential amino acids, Doug, in a quite a small amount, and if you were to only eat that food over the course of the day for all of your calories, and it wouldn't provide that essential amino acid in the amount your body requires, then that would be significantly downgraded in terms of the score given to that food. But of course, when we're eating lots of different foods, that's actually irrelevant. So the DS scoring system, to me, which is the one that's most commonly kind of referred to online, is really only relevant in the context of food security problems where people are getting all of their calories from one or two plants. So that would be something I kind of wanted to tack on there. And I agree with Layne, we need more research in the elderly. They're a different population. They do have anabolic resistance, and it'll be interesting to see the difference between plant and animal proteins in the context of that population. And then to kind of round this out, your question was about animal versus plant protein. What's superior? And I think we have to define superior. We've zoomed in here a lot on muscle protein synthesis and strength, for example. But arguably there's also we should be considering the effect on human health outcomes, chronic disease as well. And when you look at that, we see very, very consistently that there are huge benefits up for grabs by swapping out calories from animal protein for plant protein. And I can refer people to the Sina Nagshi, I think that's how you pronounce it, 2020 meta-analysis. I'll give you the link to that, which was published in the British Medical Journal. You can see there's a clear advantage from consuming more plant protein. Now, that's not an isolated finding. There are many different substitution analyses looking at the same thing. When you're swapping calories from animal protein for plant protein, you are reducing your risk of many of these non-communicable chronic diseases that we've normalized in our society. And so I think it's important to entertain that in our kind of definition of what is superior. And I know today's discussion is not about planetary health, but if I was to go down the rabbit hole, my personal definition of protein quality is about human health and planetary health. We have a huge problem to solve in the next, 100 years, 50, 100 years, where we need to feed 10, 11 billion people enough protein in a sustainable manner. And that's in fact one of the most critical problems that our food system needs to solve. And if you go into that and you look at land use and you look at greenhouse gas emissions and you look at preserving fresh water, it is very, very clear that we need more people to eat more plant protein and less animal protein. And as it stands today in developed countries like the United States, where you are, like Australia, currently 70 to 85% of our daily protein intake is coming from animal protein. And really, we need to start to change the paradigm and flip that a bit on its head, lean more into plant protein. And I'm of the view that that will be best for our long-term health and also for the health of the planet, which of course all of us are relying on.
Well said, Simon. I think that's a good place for us to end our combo, and I think this has been awesome. As you know, there's so much information out there when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to diet, when it comes to weight loss, like all the things. And I'm so glad I was able to have both you and Layne on here to kind of sift through that. And I was actually kind of surprised. I thought there would be at least one disagreement where you guys would kind of go back and forth on something, but I was wrong. And it's really cool to see that we can take two people who eat two probably totally different ways in the way they consume some of their calories and kind of come together and find all these common themes to help the general population, which I think is so needed right now. I don't think it's about, whether you should be keto, vegan. I don't think it's about any of that. I think that the bigger issue is, what are some of the simple things we can do? Pay more attention to how many calories we're eating. Pay more attention to the type of calories we're eating. Limit processed foods, right? That sort of thing. Pay attention to where we are getting our protein from, making sure it is from a source, whether it is an animal product or whether it isn't, that isn't super high in saturated fat, that isn't going to be a risk factor for disease later on in life. And so I wanted to thank you both. I know Layne had to jump for your time. And so Simon, I know people can find Layne at Biolayne. I'll make sure to plug his info in the show notes. Simon, where's the best place for people to check you out?
Sure. So on Instagram, it's at Simon Hill. On Twitter, at The Proof. And if you're not kind of tired of listening to my voice, then I'd love to have you over on my podcast, and that is The Proof with Simon Hill.
Amazing. Well, I will make sure to include all of that in the show notes. And for those listening, there's going to be a lot of takeaways here. There might be some surprises. There might be some things you already knew. There might be some things that are confirming things you may have already known, but maybe were afraid to admit. And what I want you to do is to share some takeaways. Maybe it was something that we recently just discussed about protein. Maybe it was something that we discussed about like simple steps somebody can take when they're trying to change the way they eat, whether it's focusing on quality or tracking their calories. Maybe it was what we talked about at the beginning of the conversation when it came to Simon and Layne's view on the biggest myth out there, or whatever else it was. Make sure to tag Simon and to tag Layne, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and we'll see you next time.